Good morning. Good morning, all. Thank you for coming to day 2 of this year's Science, Technology, and Human Rights Conference hosted by the AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition. I wanted to recap a few things, a few themes from yesterday before we dive into the sessions today, which are equally, if not more, packed with content and important conversations as yesterday. So one thing that came up over and over yesterday was the framework for the connections between science and human rights, the different ways that they intersect. The right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. That scientists themselves, as humans, have rights and enjoy the rights and protections of the human rights framework. That science has applications for human rights. That scientists have a responsibility to uphold human rights. We heard several ways to talk about that yesterday and ways to understand the responsibilities of scientists for human rights, and that scientists and scientific organizations, professional associations within the sciences advocate for human rights as a constituency for human rights. We heard examples of that yesterday as well. More specifically, we heard about how that framework and the connections between science and human rights, and also the understandings of the different roles that identifies for scientific associations and societies as members of civil society, scientists as professionals, scientists as individuals, distinct and independent from their governments, as we talked about yesterday in the example of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also in other examples related to educational pedagogies and psychology, the ways that scientists are centering these values in publicly engaged science, and how it's improving the quality of scientific research with empirical evidence to back that up. The importance of the media in making the connections between science and human rights that came up several times yesterday, and also looking to the future, building the future, educating students, engaging students directly in this work, thinking about experiential learning as an opportunity for students to learn more about publicly engaged science, and looking to the future for the roles we need for accountability, for government action as having specific responsibilities for human rights. So, incorporating all of those themes, but maybe particularly the applications of science for human rights. We have our first panel this morning. I'm delighted to welcome our speakers here and online to talk on visible LGBT, innovations in documenting LGBTQ plus rights violations in Mexico. And so I'll turn it over to our moderator, Batilda Muñoz-Pogosian from the Organization of American States. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. And if you don't mind, I would be moderating from right here. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Of course, I would like first to thank the American Association for the Advancement of Science for the opportunity to moderate this discussion. I'm always excited to take part in events like this, because they're really unique opportunities to explore the work that we do and how it intersects with other fields, in this case, technology, and with very specific and concrete examples of the application of technology to human rights issues. Let me say that I'm here representing the Department of Social Inclusion in the Secretariat for Access to Rights and Equity at the Organization of American States, where we have the mandate of supporting countries of the Americas in their efforts and initiatives to improve conditions of access to rights and promote social inclusion and greater equity in the Americas. And in order to do this, in order to achieve this, we focus on populations in situations of vulnerability, which include, or among the groups that we are always focusing our work, We're talking about older persons, the youth, indigenous peoples, peoples of African descent, migrants and refugees, and LGBTQ plus persons, and the many ways these groups intersect, which provide unique challenges for many people and for the work that we do. Since 2016, the department has been dedicated to finding ways that it can contribute to improving data collection so that we have a better sense of the numbers of LGBTQ plus persons in the region, as well as the specific challenges they face. We all hear the reports, so we know the challenges that these populations face in the Americas, but just knowing is not enough to appropriately address the challenges they face and develop policies that could overcome those challenges. We also know how governments work. They need hard numbers, they need data, evidence, and to acknowledge that there is a problem and then to inform the design and implementation of policies. The department, I must mention, serves as technical secretariat for the working group for the analysis of national reports that are linked, which is a group of experts that monitor the implementation of the Protocol of San Salvador. It's an additional protocol to the Human Rights Convention that entered into force in 1999. And what we do, we accompany the work that this group does in evaluating the progress that the countries are making. I must also say that we have the representation and we cooperate with the special rapporteurship in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights that is reviewing the implementation and the bringing of rights of economic, social, economic, and environmental rights to people in the Americas. One specific example that I wanted to bring to your attention as we start the discussion in this panel, and I'm going to turn it over to the speakers very soon, is an effort that was implemented to try to measure the gaps in terms of the access of these type, the economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights for LGBTI people. This is sort of in the framework of a process to measure all the gaps, not just evaluate the implementation of the contents of the protocol in general terms, but really looking at specific populations. And so far, we've developed this guide to measure the access of these type of rights to LGBTI people. The name of the publication that was launched a couple of years ago is called Measuring All the Gaps, a guide for the operationalization. I'm sorry about if I could pronounce that well. Operacionalización is easier in Spanish. Of the indicators of the Protocol of San Salvador from a cross-sectional LGBTI perspective. I must say that, Juan was also part of this effort. We are also engaging with countries in the Caribbean and specifically with the initiative Open for Business, a Caribbean influencer program to try to develop indicators to measure the cost of excluding LGBTI people in the region and try to also build a network of business leaders willing to generate opportunities for these populations in the particular case of the Caribbean, which we know is a bit challenging. So today we have an excellent panel. We're going to explore this topic a little bit further, this topic of data collection, how it is also a pending obligation for the states of the region. And we will zero in on how, in the case of Mexico, Visible.LGBT, a non-governmental platform developed by a Mexican NGO with the support of Georgetown University, has allowed the collection of violent and discriminatory incidents against LGBTQ plus people, and it's really a good example of how ICTs, how technologies can counter societal misinformation and provide data to decision makers for the design and implementation of policies. The dynamic of the panel this morning is as follows. I will introduce each of our distinguished panelists, and then I will invite them to make a brief intervention of about 5 minutes. After that, we will definitely have a space for Q&A. We're going to start with Juan Pablo Delgado, to my left. He's CEO of Amicus, a civil society organization based in León, Guanajuato, Mexico, which since 2015 has been working every day to defend and promote the rights of Mexican LGBTIQ plus people. He's a Mexican lawyer with experience in the defense of human rights, management of civil society organizations, and public administration. Juan Pablo is also the creator of the platform. And as the creator of the platform, can you tell us a bit more about how you and your team went about setting the platform, how the site, please, if you could share how the site works and show some successes, some examples of how it has been successful in terms of collecting data to inform decision making.
Thank you, Matilda, and thank you everyone for being here. Also, thank you to Nate, who was really helpful in trying to bring this in person to DC. I used to live in DC a couple of years ago, so it's been a couple of years since I last spoke English, really. So if I have some flaws in my English, I apologize in advance. I'm going to present to you some of the successes that we have had managing this platform. But to begin with, I wanted to share that there's a couple of things that you need to know. First of all, that American states in general, by American states, I mean the countries of the entire continent, do not generally collect data on LGBTQ people. Maybe we think about the governments of the United States and Canada could be a couple of exceptions of those, of that statement. But in general, Latin American countries and the countries in the Caribbean do not do that. And so that imposes a problem in terms of developing and designing any type of policies that are designed to tackle some of the obstacles that we face as a population. And also, so another thing that you need to know is that Mexican people in general, and even more so LGBTQ people, do not trust the judicial system, the justice system. And this imposes a big obstacle because we do not trust those institutions. And of course, every time we face a situation of discrimination or violence, we do not immediately think on going before the authorities to try to get access to justice. And so if we think about collecting data on discrimination and violence, both situations, the fact that the government is not willing to collect this information, but also that the population is not willing to go before the authorities, impose a couple of big challenges. And so when I was doing my master's degree in Georgetown University at the McCord School of Public Policy, there was this program designed for innovation in public policy. The program doesn't exist anymore. That's quite sad because they would give a grant to 5 graduate students to develop projects that would relate mostly with technology and policy. And so I pitched the idea of developing a platform that would allow Mexican people, both people who experience discrimination, violence, but also people who can witness that or who witness any discriminatory violent event, to report that themselves. And so I had the luck of being guided by Georgetown's faculty, including Fanny, who's here, Fanny, who teaches at Georgetown Law School, but also the faculty at the Public Policy School, people who are experts in data collection and survey design, on data visualization. And so the methods really guided the entire process of coming up with the solution. The platform really collects data on virtually every type of incident that is violent or discriminatory against our populations. And so the process for developing the survey that we utilize online to collect this information was very carefully drafted after a process of about a year, where we tested the survey again and again and again so that we could virtually sort of encompass every type of discriminatory or violent event that the people could potentially face in Mexico. And so with the implementation process, now it has been 4 years since we started, we have sort of added some other type of incidents that we didn't sort of consider at the beginning. And so the survey has really made sort of improved by the pass of time. The platform has quite an interesting thing that is it offers complete anonymity for the people who report. And so that's an incentive for people to do any type of complaint in the platform, because all their privacy and their personal data is entirely protected. And at the same time, since the platform is hosted by an NGO, we thought that would also be an incentive to report before an NGO as opposed to before the authorities. That is one of the challenges that the judicial system in general faces in Mexico. Once we collect the reports, we clean the data that we collect so that we don't publish any type of personal data, and we put that in an open database that's available for everyone. So, and in a very accessible way. So journalists can get access to that to create any type of note in the media outlet, but also someone who's doing a thesis in their graduate degree or an NGO who's trying to do some incidents before their government. So the data is quite accessible for everyone, and it's available in formats to process through statistical software, but also in very regular terms in Excel, so that everyone can access to that and understand what we were describing in the database. As of September 2022, we collaborate now with 35 institutions. These are NGOs, but also local governments in Mexico, who are willing to collaborate with the platform so that we have a better understanding on how discrimination violence operate against LGBTQ people in the country. And so far we are participating in 22 states out of the 32 in the entire country. So we are advancing gradually to cover the entire territory in our alliances. Thanks to this work out of 4 years of really important efforts, we received this year the award from the Mexican Institution of Access to Information as the best platform for collecting data on any issue in the country, even sort of like above really important institutions in Mexico that have existed like for 30 years. So we are really happy about it, but we're also aware that our platform offers a complete solution, because we do not only produce the data, but we also systematize that data, and we're also ensuring that this data is employed by different stakeholders in the country. So if we cover the entire data collection process, it makes sense that they gave us this award, because not everyone takes the effort of not only producing that data, but also make it employable, right? And so I'm going to give you some description of what we have found out through this data collection process. In general terms, we have collected over, this is up to September, but now I know there are a little bit more, so over 1,600 reports. This may sound as little, but we are the largest database in the country in terms of how discrimination and violence operates against LGBTQ people. The average reporting number has increased gradually through the year. So we started by receiving around 13 reports per month. And this year we have increased that rate up to 53 monthly reports. However, in the last 3 months, we have received over 100. And so this is not just, this cannot be concluded as discrimination and violence increasing in the country, but rather that we are increasing our alliances with people, and that the community is getting to know the platform increasingly. And so that's how we think, that's why we think that the number has increased over time. But also we have now quite an interesting alliance with Grindr. I don't know if everyone here knows what Grindr is, but I'm sure that you know what Tinder is. So Grindr is the dating app for LGBTQ community, mostly used by gay men, I have to say that. But so that's a really important outlet to socialize existing in the platform in the country. And so since we started this collaboration, reports have gradually increased in the country. So this is like a really important alliance now for the platform. As you can see, the number of reports have increasingly raised over time, and that's a sign of success. In terms of gender identity and sexual orientation, the groups that have reported the most have been cisgender men that are associated with men who are gay, bisexual, with other sexual orientations, transgender women, and cisgender women being that women who are bisexual, who are lesbian, or any other sexual orientation. And in terms of sexual orientations, most of the reports come from gay victims, followed by lesbian victims, and finally bisexual victims. This also shows how privileges operate within the community, because again, gay men receive the most attention, even in this platform that is self-reported. And that could have a link, for example, with the fact that most people who use this Grindr or dating app are gay men. But that again shows how privileges operates, because we have a digital platform for dating that's carefully drafted, but particularly for gay men. So what would happen if there were other solutions for the rest of the community? Maybe these numbers could eventually shift a little bit. So this is, I just put this these graphs to show you that we have also collected reports by different gender identities that are not the most present ones in general in human rights reports, and the same happens for sexual orientation. So there's a whole variety of identities that we've been able to collect through the existence of this platform. By state, and I'm not hoping for you to understand how geography is in Mexico, but so these states I'm showing here are more or less those states that have the most, like the biggest populations in the country, the largest populations in the country, the largest concentrations of people. But also has to do with the fact that we have really good alliances with governments and civil society organizations in these states. There are a couple of states that should be there if the only associated factor could be population. And we're starting to create those alliances so that we can encompass a little bit more reporting rates in the country. So again, that an entity or that a state has more reports do not mean that this is a more violent place. It's just that we have bigger or more important connections with governments and civil society organizations. I think so just for you to know what type of reports we collect the most frequent type of aggressions that we have been able to collect are verbal aggressions. And by this, I mean, not only things that people say to other people in the street or like literally verbally, but also things that happen online. Because violence through social media has also been captured by the existence of the platform. Then the impediment of entry to any type of space, whether that's a governmental or not space, and then the denial of services coming from the government just by the fact of being LGBTQ. And then I think this is a quite important thing to mention. 1 out of every 2 reports in the platform are made by the victims themselves. And if we combine this statistic with the fact that 6 out of every 10 reports we received were not previously reported anywhere else, we are really truly having original information in the platform that cannot be found anywhere else, just by the existence of the platform. And so just let me, because Matilda is telling me that my time is over, but I just want to tell you a little examples of how this platform has been successful of driving change in the country. To begin with, this is the case of taxi drivers in a city, in a somewhat little city in Mexico. So it turns out that the civil society organization that we partnered with in this city found out through the platform that there was a systematic attitude from taxi drivers in the city of discrimination against the LGBTQ populations. And so once they find out that there was a trend, they came before the company because they don't have Uber there. I mean, I know it's crazy, but they don't have Uber there yet. And so it's really, so the taxi drivers companies are just 2. And so they went there before the owners of these companies and told them, this is happening. And it shouldn't be. So what they did was to show through data that the discrimination was happening in the private transportation companies in the city, and now they have an alliance to combat discrimination in their company. And so that's like that a small intervention that happened because of the data that we collect. Then this is the case of Luis and Gustavo, who were discriminated against by a real estate company when they were trying to buy a house in the state of San Luis Potosí. Their case is now before the Supreme Court, and their lawyer asked us to write an amicus curiae brief to the court describing what type of incidents we have received in platform regarding discrimination coming from real estate companies. And so that has been really successful because we described to the judges or to the justices in this case what that this is a systematic attitude coming from the real estate companies, not only in San Luis Potosí, but in the entire country. Another example of this is the anti-bullying bill recently introduced in my home state, Guanajuato. This is a congresswoman in the legislature who recently presented an initiative to include LGBTQ bullying in the legislation as a prohibited means of bullying. And she, instead of reading the motivation as every other legislator does in the world, she just read before the entire Congress the testimonies of the people that have reported discrimination in their schools, and was a very powerful speech that was even portrayed in the national media. Then in the case of the state of Jalisco, which is maybe one of the most populated states in the country, you may have heard before of Puerto Vallarta and Guadalajara. Well, this is the state where those cities are. We have a sustained collaboration for 3 years now with the government. And thanks to the data we have collected through 3 years of implementation of the platform, now the local government designed a policy to follow up with every type of discrimination that LGBTQ people face in that state. The governor has even mentioned our collaboration in his annual reports, or their sort of like the state of the state. It informs every year. And finally, our data has even gone international, both at the Organization of American States, Matilda knows about those collaborations, but also at the UN system. The best example and most recent example of this was the last report made by the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity at the United Nations, Victor Madrigal, who employed our data in his latest report on LGBTQ people and their right to health. So as you can see, we have been able to combine human rights standards with scientific methods from social sciences together with technology to drive some social good in the country. And so thank you for your attention. And if you want to follow us in our social media, that's it. Or if you want to go online to our site, you can see some visualizations and download the data if you're interested in getting to know more about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Excellent overview of Visible LGBT. And please think of your questions. We're going to have a space at the end for Q&A. I would like now to turn it over to our panelist that's online, Geraldina González de la Vega. Ms. González de la Vega is the president of the Mexico City Council to Prevent and Eliminate Discrimination. And the purpose of this institution is to generate a cultural change that allows individuals and groups to enjoy rights and freedoms without any type of discrimination through the design, implementation, and application of strategies on the prevention and elimination of discrimination and the development of citizen attention, education, training, dialogue programs with civil society, social movements, academia, let's just say the whole ecosystem in Mexican society, in the particular case of the city of Mexico. Geraldine, I would like now to ask you about the case of Mexico and the specific work that COPRED is carrying out. And we also wanted to know about any efforts currently underway in the council regarding data collection and use of that data on LGBTI people. And also if there has been any collaboration between COPRED and Visible on this. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's try to keep it to the 5 minutes because our time is closing in on us. So back to you.
Thank you very much, Betilde. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for the presentation of Juan Pablo. I greet you from Mexico City. And well, it's very important what just Juan Pablo presented and mentioned about the use of science and tech in order to understand discrimination and violence against LGBT people. The COPRED is the Council to Prevent and Eliminate Discrimination of Mexico City, and our collaboration with Visible is recent. I've known the project since it started, but actually we started collaborating early this year. Juan Pablo presented, and his team, they presented the latest results of the LGBT violence in the country, in Mexico City, with special emphasis in Mexico City. And as he showed, the data collection of Mexico City is, well, really huge. It doesn't mean, and I agree with his interpretation, that Mexico City is one of the most violent cities for LGBT people, but instead that, well, we have the largest population in the country, but also that the people here in Mexico City has stopped normalizing discrimination and violence against LGBT people. This said, well, since this presentation, we started collaborating. The COPRED has an attention center which receives discrimination complaints on any sphere. This is very important to say because that's a very important difference that the COPRED has between the ombudspersons or human rights commissions, in Spanish, Comisiones de Derechos Humanos. We can receive any complaint in private sector. And this means that we can receive complaints of discrimination that happened in restaurants, bars, schools, universities, and every private place. This is important in order to understand how discrimination and violence works and moves and towards who, which people happens. Sometimes the complaints that COPRED receives are not solely discrimination, or they are not discrimination. In any case, COPRED files them and as attentions, and we document the specifics such as place, persons, ages, time, the reason of the violence, among others. It's very important to say that COPRED attends every group that's in a situation of being discriminated, and not only LGBT people. So we have to take this data from our database and well, supply it to Visible. If the case in attendance or attention is it is of our competence, then we actually open a specific file in order to start an administrative process. This is a non-jurisdictional process in which we use restorative justice tools in order to approach to justice. The data collected in those files is also supplied to Visible. So the database of COPRED right now is still very simple, and we do not have the possibility to crisscross the many of the variables. So actually this platform is helping us to understand how discrimination and violence happens in Mexico City in a map, understanding which people, where and why is being discriminated and assaulted or violated. Also, I wanted to say that, some of the information that we have in Visible is being translated into public actions, meaning that we have a very special problem right now in Zona Rosa, for example, which is a very popular bar and restaurant zone for young people, especially LGBT people. So we are turning into understanding what's happening right there through Visible tool. So this tool is very powerful also because it allows the government to map discrimination and violence that has not been formally filed to local authorities. Like Juan Pablo said, sadly, legal culture, but also trust in authorities are still missing. And without data, it would be very difficult to understand how LGBTQ people are being discriminated. And also, in order to promote this trust in authorities and injustice in the justice system, we need this data to design public policies, actions, laws, whatever is needed in order to avoid, to eliminate this discrimination and violence. And I will cut it right here because I think my time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geraldina. Thanks so much for that overview of specificities of the case of Mexico and we're happy to hear that you are going to be collaborating with Juan Pablo and the platform to make this possible for the city. Our next and last panelist before we open for questions is Fanny Cata Gomez Lugo. Fanny is an adjunct professor at the law faculty at Georgetown University, where she's teaching courses on human rights, sexual orientation and gender identity, and sexual and reproductive rights. She also happens to be one of the members of the advisory board at Estrella Lesbian Foundation, as well as this platform, Visible LGBT. She's a member of the network of LGBTQ litigants of Latin America and the Caribbean, and a consultant with the UN, the United Nations. So, Fanny, I wanted to ask you about the regional situation in terms of LGBTQ plus data collection, and whether you see or you think platforms such as Visible can be relevant in efforts underway, and also if you could share a bit more about your role as advisor to the platform.
Thank you very much, Betilde and Juan Pablo. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today. I will just start by saying that LGBT organizations in Latin America and the Caribbean have been really advocating for more data on data collection on states. From a human rights perspective, states have the obligation to produce and collect data. This is important for public policy and for a variety of actions to guide government actions in the right place. However, as Juan Pablo stated earlier, the vast majority of states in the region and around the world don't really collect data, that it's disaggregated and intersectional in nature. So sexual orientation, gender identity, and all the other different kind of aspects for vulnerabilities. So for example, race, age, deprivation of liberty, etc. And so what civil society organizations have been doing for many, many, many years, in addition to advocate for data collections, is to expose the level of violence and discrimination that they face in our countries. And so, as was mentioned earlier, the Organization of American States has two organs, bodies that oversee compliance with human rights. One of them is the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. The other one is in the Inter-American Court. The only reason why I give this context is to explain that in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which actually the Secretariat is right here on 19th and F, the Inter-American Commission have been really focusing on issues around LGBT rights. And they established a unit back in 2011. And basically, again, the information was several hearings from victims of violence and discrimination for many, many years saying, we're being killed. Life expectancy of trans women in Latin America is 35 years of age. There's really nothing that's been done. And so when I was at the commission, we were there, it was like, well, we really need to assess the level of violence. What are we talking about? How many numbers? And then we tried to look at, this is 10 years ago, we tried to look at what's out there in terms of data collection. Again, very few states. And at the time, only a number of civil society organizations were doing this work. I'll pause here also to say that, as I mentioned this, it is a state obligation on the international human rights law to produce this data. And then when the state doesn't do it, then civil society organizations like Amicus and through the platform of Visible go and, of course, fill that void. The problem with that is that, of course, lack of funding and also the lack of integration with public information systems. So, of course, because there's no data collection on the states, then civil societies come in and kind of fill that gap. And so when I was at the commission, again, because there was not a lot of information as to the extent of the violence, the type of the violence, we did a very rudimentary kind of exercise. Literally, I was talking about it with a person who collaborated last night about this. And we were literally looking at Google alerts. We were like, Google alerts, violence, killings, LGBT people. And I'm talking about an Excel spreadsheet of 10,000, 15,000 entries. And this is like very basic. We're actually looking at what's in the news, what organizations are saying. Very few organizations were saying this. And according to this, this was just a pilot, an exercise to really kind of determine, again, to have some numbers around this. And basically, in the context of 15 months, and this now it just seems so far back when we did this, there were 770 attacks, including killings against LGBT people. And of course, I don't have time to go over the different kind of the trends that we got from that information. Some of it was also kind of addressed by Juan Pablo in their own exercise. But I just wanted to show you that the data was telling us what the data, very, again, Excel spreadsheet, very rudimentary, was telling us what civil society organizations were saying. So, for example, 80% of the women killed, trans women killed in that period of time during those 15 months were 35 years of age or younger. And of course, we can talk about the invisibility of certain violence. We also got some information that gay men were most likely to be killed by bladed weapons and in private spaces, whereas trans women were more likely to be killed by firearms in public spaces. And that explains a lot because it deals with usually how society has kind of pushed us at the outskirts of society and what we have to and can do and where we are able to exist and be, right? So gay men usually in private spaces, in your home, behind closed doors, trans women very out in the public, sex work, sometimes trafficking. And I wanted also to give a little bit of context on what we mean when we talk about violence. I think it's very key to explain this because I think it informs the process of data collection. Violence against LGBT people or violence based on sexualization, gender identity has been defined as a form of violence based on prejudice. So the same way we talk about violent crimes against African Americans or people of certain religion, we also kind of look at what's most commonly known as hate crimes. But what from the concept of understanding that prejudice based on sexual orientation, gender identity that are non-normative, meaning that are not heterosexual, that are not cisgender, are usually ingrained in a culture that puts us in the bottom of the pile and really it's based on a violence that seeks to pretty much, annihilate our bodies, our expression. So a lot of the violence that it's committed against LGBT people, there's a lot of also marking in the body, sort of in a way of kind of punishing the bodies and the orientation and the expressions that are outside of the norm. Lastly, I wanted to talk about in this particular aspect about so the Inter-American Commission was kind of looking at this, looking at the data, looking at what organizations were saying, really not a lot of response from states. We're talking about 10 years ago. And basically in this report, the first recommendation that the commission put forward to eliminate, investigate, and provide reparations regarding violence had to do with data collection. So it's kind of like the biggest, more fleshed out recommendation. And it goes into details about the intersectionality, about privacy, about what to do, who should collect it, and what it's for. So again, when we're talking about human rights violations and the state's obligation to prevent human rights violations, we are looking at the importance of data collection to inform what it is, what's the type of the violence that needs to be addressed and the type of discrimination, and also what is the state has to do with that information to inform public policy. The other thing so let's just move on. Again, I wanted to make sure we give a human rights context for this talk. I think this is a great panel that we're looking at so many intersectionality and also the use and the advancement of science and technology to kind of also get us closer to sustainable development goals and also get us closer to compliance with human rights. So I wanted to, this is a screenshot of of one of the reports done by the independent expert. So basically, long story short, the United Nations in 2011 created a special post of a special envoy or independent expert rapporteur on violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity. Juan Pablo alluded to this post, also saying that, and I was very proud to hear that in its most recent report, Victor Madrigal, this is again an independent expert of the United Nations looking at these issues worldwide. The independent expert Victor Madrigal, in its most recent report on the right to health, included information that was provided by BC. And so one of the first reports that Victor Madrigal did had to do with the importance of data collection. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that are said here that I think are important. First of all, data is crucial to creating visibility and building on evidence based on human rights abuses and potential response to them. Some states deny the existence of violence or discrimination against LGBT people. So it's not just the importance of having the data to produce a public policy that is effective to address the needs, but it's also to counter this idea that we don't necessarily face violence and discrimination, that we're just kind of like, we have so much gay privilege if such a thing exists, and where you can just happily go about our lives. The other very important thing to highlight here is that data should be the basis for policymakers and advocates. Data should be the basis for policymakers and advocates to create more effective state measures for socioeconomic inclusion, access to health and education, inclusion in the civic and political sphere, anti-discrimination measures, prevention of abuse, and access to justice. What happens when you don't have this data? What's driving the policies is a stigma and prejudice on state officials. So again, those three aspects I think are important to highlight. Finally, the report's available online. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that what Visible LGBT is doing is really at the forefront of what we need to be doing in terms of human rights abuses. So we're all the time saying to states, you have to prevent human rights abuses, you have to investigate human rights abuses, you have to use due diligence to provide reparations, et cetera, et cetera. But in order for a state to do that, it really needs to collect data. The state is not collecting this data. The civil society organizations are collecting this data. They're filling this void. But also all of this to say that it is such a key issue that the very first report on one of the very first reports by this independent expert worldwide was the need to collect data. And in this report, there were 7 principles I just wanted to highlight. But we don't have time to go into detail on them, but just do no harm, self-determination, privacy and confidentiality, lawful use, participation, transparency and accountability, and impartiality. Finally, the last comment that I wanted to make before I wrap up is that we really, unfortunately, cannot talk about these issues without addressing the issues of the opposition. So basically, the more visible we are in terms of our struggles, our fights, the more states are passing legislation, adopting public policies on LGBT equality, non-discrimination, for example, prohibition of the so-called conversion therapies, et cetera, the more risk we also face of backlash by opposition groups. And so there are a lot of organizations that have and also just to say here, because this is a key point, if we don't have the data to collect, if we don't have the data collected on violence and discrimination against LGBT people, this is also an invitation for the opposition to say there's really no violence and discrimination. So why are we talking about this, right? And so I also wanted to highlight, this is from a report from AWID, Association of Women in Development, and they have an observatory on the universality of rights. And it's basically how the opposition works in terms of what their strategies they use to counter our progress. And one of it, I wanted to say, is development of alternative scientific sources to intellectualize and give authority to regressive positions that stem from extreme interpretation of religion, culture, and tradition. If we don't have objective data to counter this, we leave a void for opposition groups, opposition forces to again deny the existence of our rights. And then the last thing, I really wanted to finalize with a reflection that actually just it makes me incredibly proud to have been a part of the platform that Juan Pablo started. I've known Juan Pablo for a few years now. He was my student at Georgetown Law. We did a fact-finding mission to Guyana to interview LGBT people who were facing violence and discrimination, and we did a report. But I'm so proud to feel that I'm part of something. I remember sitting with Juan Pablo a few years ago, 2018. He, again, as was mentioned, was part of the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. And the Baker Center had given him this grant. And basically starting with the basic questions. How do we ask people to self-identify? Are we gonna say people, is it going to be this way? What do we do with children? What do we do with this category? And actually just sitting with him and discussing all these things and then seeing how only a few years later, it has become this adolescent, not you, the project, from baby to adolescence years. And I'm sure it's been a lot of growing pains. But I'm really happy that you went through that presentation and also gave us towards the end kind of the impact that it has created on the lives. So it's not just collecting data for the sake of collecting data, but also the fact that you're adapting to new technologies. Grindr is pretty groundbreaking to be kind of doing that. So thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm open to questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, querida Fanny, for your remarks. And we will now, we have about 15 minutes. We may steal another 5 from you. We will see. For Q&A. So if you would like to make a question for our panelists, please go ahead. Either one of those mics. Oh, no, this one on the left.
Thank you. Good morning, Giza Dang for Treatment Action Group. I wanted to first thank you for doing this project, but also for presenting it in such detail, because as you said, data is so very crucial, especially for representing communities that are not often at the table where they should be. And so my question has to do with your sustainability and your funding. I'm not going to ask you to disclose your funders, but I would like to understand a bit more about what types of organizations or institutions are funding this kind of work. What kind of donor advocacy are you doing? Or do you wish would be done in order to keep this work going, especially at this cusp of technology and human rights? And I'm asking because I know a number of organizations that would like to do similar work that, will look to you as an example. Thank you.
So funding is like quite a challenge. We had been seeking for a couple of years funding to just start with the project, and the fact that Georgetown has opened this grant opportunity while I was doing my master's allowed to develop the project. But what you can see online, if you go to visible.lgbt in your cell phone, is really like the 5th version of the platform, because we have improved it over time. And so we currently receive funds for our organization in general. Visible is just a part of the organization, coming from the 2 biggest donors for Latin American organizations, that stands for LGBTQ individuals. Both organizations are based here in the United States. I'm actually going to go see my donors on Thursday in New York. But unfortunately, donors usually just fund strategies most based in litigation, because we do a lot of litigation in Mexico, or sort of advocacy before legislatures, advocacy before international bodies and that type of thing. But really, data collection on LGBTQ issues is still something that donors do not quite understand the importance for doing that activity. So we're actually seeking actively for funding that could go directly to the platform. What we do is that because we do litigation, we stand for the argument before the donors that we need data to even do the litigation, because it's not the same bringing a case before a judge without the data. But it's just like an accessory or like some sort of a component of the overall project, when this project as a whole should be funded individually. But I mean, we've been seeking for funding here in the United States and some other institutions, but still it's quite difficult to obtain those funds, particularly because sometimes funders even sort of raise the question if self-reporting data is accurate data. And I have to be very honest that before the McCord School of Public Policy here in Washington, that was one of the first questions they raised. But when I made a point that this is the only way of collecting data at the moment, then I convinced the whole Georgetown faculty to give us the money. But it's not the same to do that before people who are experts in policy than before the donors, right? And so I think they do need to have this sensibilization on the fact that without data, and I'm not talking about only LGBTQ communities, but rather any other population who's at risk, we cannot really advance on tackle down the issues that we face. So if you know of any potential donors, and that to be honest, that's one of the reasons that we're here, because by presenting the platform before you and before the AAAS and some other organizations, we could potentially seek or collaborations that could lead to funding or to funding directly by itself. So thank you for the question, because I think that was one of those things that I would expect for you to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. We have another question here, sir.
Yes, you may have covered this some, but I'm sure you did. I'd like to know a little bit more about the publicity that you engage in to find cases in Mexico City and elsewhere. And also whether you take a kind of proactive view, that is to go out and seek cases or do surveys or go to places where people may congregate. I'd be interested in both in the publicity and also in the way you collect the information.
So the publicity that we started doing 4 years ago when we started was entirely based in social media. Luckily, with the funding, we've been able to sort of pay for some advertisements in social media that have been quite effective, particularly on Facebook and Instagram. We're facing now the chance to do a collaboration with TikTok. We are on Instagram, Twitter, and on Facebook. Now we're shifting towards TikTok because TikTok is interested in promoting the platform. That again poses a challenge for us as an organization because I mean, I have a personal TikTok and it consumes a lot of my time. Just imagine how much time it consumes from a civil society organization to do just this type of videos that can go viral. Then the collaboration with this dating app, Grindr, which is the largest LGBTQ, but again, mostly gay dating app in the world, is quite important because Grindr does sort of like put out there every 3 weeks. And it's quite clear that every 3 weeks we receive the largest reports since we started collaborating. And so that they even funded sort of like a summit that we did in Mexico together with the organizations that we work with. But I didn't say that in my presentation, but half of the reports come directly from the victims, and that could inform how effective we've been seeking for those reports. Another aspect that I don't want to forget is that we're collaborating quite closely with LGBTQ specialized media outlets. And I remember a presentation yesterday in journalism and highlighting the importance of specialized media communications or media outlets. And so that's one of the collaborations that has also been quite powerful. However, given that the pandemic gave LGBTQ people and the general population in the world really bad news, now people online don't want to see things that can make them sad or can upset them. And so we have detected that even in this LGBTQ outlets, LGBTQ media outlets, people are not willing to even read whatever bad things are happening against the community. So we are actually creating a new strategy with these media outlets so we can give good examples on how important it is to report to create change. So instead of saying that there was a killing in Mexico City in a nightclub, we would say, thanks to your report, this couple from the state of San Luis Potosí are facing their case before the Supreme Court. And thanks to your report, they may be able to access to justice. But this is a change of narrative. And it again, imposes a big challenge for us as an organization to create this type of stories that can incentivize people to do the reports. And then, so we said half of the reports come directly from the victims, but 30% come from civil society organizations. And so the fact of being able to engage with these local organizations is crucial. And so we are targeting some local organizations that really do really important work in their states. But this again imposes a challenge for us because we have to go to their states, give them tools to promote the tool, but more in a community-based level. And again, without the proper funding, it's quite challenging for us to do that. We're going to do a visit to 4 states in the south of Mexico in November, because we want to increase the level of reporting in the south, which is usually the area, the geographic area in Mexico that's really left behind in any type of policy. But so that had been most of the strategies that we've followed to collect this report. And every now and then my team go to different companies or schools or universities to speak about the platform. And that way we can share the word about its existence. But it's sort of what we've been doing. And of course, the fact that it's an internet or like a web-based service really helps to spread the word, right? Because you can tweet about it, you can post it about it in social media, you can share it really easily with everyone through any type of technological device. But again, we do need more funding to do more work and socialize the platform in a greater level.
Excellent. And the point that you're making, that is technology, but with the proper narratives to make that technology useful. So that's a very good point. I want to ask Fanny as well as Geraldina, if you guys are aware of other efforts in LGBTQ plus data collection that we may share, things that could stay on our radar as we move this conversation forward. Let's start with Geraldina.
Thank you, Batilde. Well, no, I am not aware of any other project like Visible. Actually, I was trying to say that the data collection that Visible does in Mexico, as a country in Mexico City, as a locality, it's very important in order to understand how this violence and discrimination occurs and what can we do in order to tackle it. So I am not aware of any other project like this in Mexico City. I don't know in other localities, in other states in the country, but actually I think it's the only one that's doing this data collection. Yeah.
Yeah, we do have a question from online that's asking for Victor whether there's a mechanism that requires states to report on LGBTQI+ discrimination, and would such a mechanism promote more extensive data collection in the Americas?
Okay.
If there's a mechanism?
So if there's a mechanism
for the states to report?
Yeah.
Okay, can I take both of the questions then?
Yeah, take them both,
okay,
please.
I'd love to also hear what the co-panelists think about the last one, but I'll start with the first one. As I mentioned, I just want to give a little bit of context. The issue of visibility and advocacy for LGBT rights have really, increased in the past 10 years, right? So LGBT organizations in the ground have been really, really fighting for this visibility for a long time. However, most of these, requests and push has been unanswered by the state. So I would say that I don't know any other platform that collects the data the same way Visible does. Self-reporting through a platform in this way, and then also the data being collected being useful to creating trends and also to inform policy and cases. So the way I see it, this exercise and this pilot, it used to be a pilot, now it's again a young adult, a teenager, which I'm sure is still acting out. But it is really a 360, the way I see it, in terms of not only collecting the data, but how it's used, how it's processed, and how it informs other processes. I would say that because it would be a disservice also to the LGBT movement in general in Latin America, that there are organizations and networks collecting data. So, for example, there is a network called Red Sin Violencia, so Network Without Violence on LGBT. And it's a network of several organizations in several countries, kind of really putting together their data that they have to kind of examine. And also the vast majority, if not all, organizations that do LGBT work in Latin America and the Caribbean do collect their data, but their data is, through it's more like people coming and reporting what's seen in the news. As I explained, the exercise that I did at the commission, but nothing like this in terms of a digital platform that does all that. And then with respect to the question, so another opportunity to really congratulate Juan Pablo and the great work that his team is doing. And then the last question was, is there a mechanism for states to report on data collection? I would say that, as I said, for the international human rights law framework, states have the obligation to do it. Is there a process to be kind of like going around behind states and being like, oh, you didn't report. There are several mechanisms. There really is no enforcement because, as we know, human rights law doesn't necessarily give a lot of teeth to the enforcement issue, at least not through the case system is an exception. But just to answer the question, there are several mechanisms where states are called to report on the implementation of treaties. So the same way at the international level, you have human rights treaties, for example, on civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights, on discrimination against women, indigenous people, etc. And when a country ratifies this treaty, it has to report every 2 or every 4 years to the committee overseeing the implementation of this treaty on how it's really treating its people, LGBT, women, indigenous people, etc. So states do have a mechanism every 2 years to report on compliance. However, that they do or they don't, that's a whole different story. And the vast majority don't necessarily do it, particularly on LGBT and particularly in the intersection of LGBT and other forms of discrimination. Because as we always say, we talk about LGBT people and LGBT movement, but the reality is that the lived experience of the different identities, orientations, and bodies is very diverse, and it really is. It's really you need to examine with intersectionality of other forms of discrimination. So that's really lacking. Yeah,
I'm going to just add something real quick because we're out of time, but. In terms of this question, if there's something else happening in the continent, in any other parts in Mexico. So I want to highlight something about this network that Fanny mentioned, the Red Sin Violencia Network Without Violence, that encompasses efforts from the entire continent. They mostly collect data on the assassination of LGBTQ people. So that's something that when Fanny and I seated to sort of see what we could do to improve the existence of this pilot in 2018 was, let's encompass every other type of discrimination and violence that it's not a killing or an assassination, and we can sort of put this platform as a unique effort in the continent because there's nothing else happening out there. And so the organization that coordinates this network without violence is a Colombian organization called Colombia Diversa, Diverse Colombia, something like that. And so Fanny and I were in Colombia 3 weeks ago, something like that. And Colombia Diversa asked our organization to pilot Visible in Colombia so that we can start doing an entire new network for the platform, but now regionally. And so that's what we're aiming for. But again, we need funding for that. And so There are a lot of plans that we're funding for that. But you know, this can sort of like demonstrate how this is a unique effort happening. It's so unique that other countries are interested in replicating the effort. And again, this self-reporting mechanism really incentivizes people to report, because if we do not trust the authorities, we in general do trust the civil society organizations that we know that have represented people before courts to bring their cases, or that have aided them in terms of promoting their cases on gender identity recognition or marriage or whatever other issue they have faced in their lives. So that would be
Excellent. I just wanted to complement what Fanny was saying, or you know, looking into the future. We will hopefully have a mechanism via the Inter-American Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination, which is a convention approved in the context of the OAS that recognizes for the first time, and no other region in the world has done it, LGBTI people as subjects of international protection. So when the last ratification comes through and the committee is activated, states will have to report on instances of discrimination and intolerance and violence against LGBTI people. So, you know, we have a few years maybe before that happens, but hopefully Visible will be strong enough with enough funding to get this, to help states get this data. So we have come to the end of the panel. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I want to thank Juan Pablo for provoking this conversation, proposing the panel and sharing about Visible LGBT, as well as Geraldina in Mexico City, and Fanny for sharing their perspective. So thank you so much.